Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. My name is Matt Hodges-Long. I'm the co-founder of the Building Safety Register. And tonight's panel session is about EWS1. So it's probably one of the subjects we get the most inbound inquiries about and talk about the most in the media as a real hot topic at the moment. So thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm going to just quickly introduce you, or ask the panel members to introduce themselves. Then I've got a very quick presentation, and then we're going to go into the meat of the conversation, which is around what's good, what's bad, and what's next for EWS1. So if I'll work across the top. So Nicky, if you could introduce yourself first, please, that would be great.
Hi everyone, I'm Nicky Venables. I'm the CEO and founder of New Build Database. So I do something similar to Matt, but at a property level rather than a building level. It's a national record of home issues.
Fantastic. Steve.
Hi, I'm Steve Mackenzie. I'm an independent fire and emergency planning expert. I'm just delighted to be here. Thank you, Matt, and look forward to a lively debate and answering questions as they arise.
Fantastic, thank you. Jason.
Hi, Matt. Thanks for inviting me. I'm an independent chartered fire engineer and looking forward to this. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. Right, okay, what I'll do, let me just quickly whip on to screen share and just very quickly share a few things with everybody. So I thought what might be quite useful, because I didn't want to assume everybody is intimately aware of what EWS1 is or how it works. So I thought I'd just put a few quick slides together just to explain a few basics, but not really talk about the meat of it. So first thing to mention is that, sorry, go back. EWS1, it was launched in December 2019 by the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. And you'll see at the top there that their logo is at the top of the form. They developed the process and they consulted with the Building Societies Association and UK Finance. As at October 2019, one of the senior managers of the RICS, or one of the directors, stated that 5,000 EWS1 forms had been completed at that point. So between December, sorry, that's October 20, that should say, sorry. So between December 2019 and October 2020, 5,000 forms were completed according to the RICS. It's important to note at this point that we've never actually seen data to support that number or how that number was calculated, but that was the number that they're on the record as saying back then in October 2020. We then have what is commonly known as EWS2. People call EWS2. It's actually EWS1 version 2, and that was launched around about the 8th of March this year. And it's effective from the 5th of April this year at the latest. So some people started using this form before the 5th of April, but definitely from the 5th of April this year, that needs to be used. It contains some additional liability exclusions. So it's gone from 1 paragraph of liability exclusions to 3. They've revised the guidance of who can sign the form. And we'll go into that in a second. And then there's some other changes around wordings of what the different grades mean, but without grinding through too much detail on that, there's been some updates. We will also see one of the other big sources of confusion we get, especially from residents, and it's understandable why, is around the RICS guidance that was launched at the same time, which went live on the 5th of April. This is actually aimed at mortgage valuers. So it's not, so they would be called surveyors, but effectively they're providing banks with mortgage valuations for flats. And this guidance is about when they should ask for an EWS1 form. So it's not about how to perform an EWS1, it's about a grid of working out when you should ask for it. But that's been really poorly communicated, I think, to residents and through the press, as though it was a wholesale change to EWS1, which it wasn't. It's just purely when it should be asked for. And again, we can take questions on any of this at the end. Signatories. Again, this is a big source of confusion. About 10% of the buildings we see are A grade. So that's looking at the attachments on the building where there's no combustibles in the external wall. And this list that you can see on the screen now is the list of institutions that qualified members of could actually sign off on those A grades. Really, it's only RICS and the IFE that we see as being active, with a few Chartered Institute of Building. We haven't seen in our collection of EWS1 forms any of the other professional bodies represented in that sample of now about 115, I think, EWS1 forms that we have on file. Where it gets interesting and difficult is when we get into the B grades. So this is about 90% of the building stock that we see. The main change in the EWS1 revision 2 is that they've now explicitly said that incorporated engineer members of the Institute of Fire Engineers are deemed to be suitably qualified signatories. So we've now got CEng and IEng as post-nominals with membership. So that person would present on the form as CEng MI Fire-E or IEng MI Fire-E. Okay, so they are the people that are blessed by the IFE and the RICS to sign these forms. Jason is one, and we've got a number of others in the audience today. They also then talk about equivalents or other relevant professionals, but we've never really managed to find anybody yet that can navigate that list or that paragraph to pop out of the other end as saying, I am the equivalent of CEng or IEng MI Fire-E. It's not to say those people don't exist, but it would be very difficult to find them. So I think Nicky later will come on to what the banks, how the banks are interpreting this, as that's her bit. Okay, so that is me done on just that sort of basics of EWS1, and we can work through in the discussion specific queries on those points. So the first thing I wanted to talk through really is, and I think I'll probably come to Jason first as the eternal optimist, of talking about what do you think, or what are you encouraged by in EWS1 in comparison to not having anything before? What are the positives that you can pick out?
Well, it is a positive. Before the EWS form itself, transactions were stopping, and of course since then thousands of transactions were able to take place. So that's a positive. I think that because there are activities within that side of building assessments, so the usual fire risk assessments have been extended to understand now what those materials are, those fire classifications, and how they come together, whether they build up a compliant wall system or not, again, is a positive thing, because if you have a safe building, it's nice to know that you live in a safe building. But also, if there is something that needs to be done, then equally, then those persons responsible can put actions in place to conclude those recommendations. So on a positive front, I think all of those things are good, and it makes our building stock overall safer and a better place to live.
Fantastic, thank you. And then Nicola, your thoughts from that?
Yeah, it's quite similar. So my good point was that from the beginning of the year in 2020, we were kind of in a position where a lot of lenders were saying we're just not going to lend on apartments. And where we are now is that they all have some level of risk appetite, even if that doesn't match RICS guidance. So we've come from a position of zero lending almost to quite a significant movement in the risk appetite of the lenders. So whilst it's probably not quite where everyone would want it to be, it's a huge improvement to where it was a year ago.
Fantastic. And Steve?
Hi, I mean, I think we have to note that RICS is a respected professional body in the UK, and they have really championed some amazing work developing international standards with the United Nations. I think EWS1 was a good mechanism to screen for valuations, but the problems have spiraled. It's now become the wrong tool for the wrong job. but it had the best intentions at the beginning. We need another stage.
Yeah.
Over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Steve. Right, yeah, so to summarise then, we think that the intent was good, something needed to be done, and there was a response. So I think that on the positive front, the industry didn't just sit back and say, let's watch everything crash, let's do something about it. So that, I think it's good to pick out the positives, but it was quite difficult as we were planning this session to actually think how we would make this bit last more than a couple of minutes, because we need to get onto the elephant in the room, which is there's quite a lot of bad stuff as well. So I think what we'll probably do, and we can circle back to this later, because if we do have any EWS1 fans out there in the audience, it'd be great to get some positive feedback as well from the audience when when we open up to Q&A. So on the bad front, I'm going to start with this one because it's something that we've been going on about since, well, just over a year now, March the 12th last year, which was around the insecurity of the EWS1 process. So we described this to Robert Jenrick and to the RICS as a magnet for fraud. And that wasn't something that we wrote lightly. Everything that we say, we try and put evidence behind. And the reason for that was we could see so much value being created by EWS, or value being destroyed, depending on how you look at it, by having the wrong grade, or the grade that you don't want, a disadvantageous grade. And it was so easy to actually falsify that grade. Whether you were a resident, whether you were an estate agent, a mortgage broker, a practitioner, there was no real inherent security in downloading a form from the internet and signing it with a pen. And to this day, that is the prevailing way of producing EWS1 forms. It hasn't changed in over a year of warning about this and providing significant and growing amounts of evidence around fraud and incompetent EWS1 provision. So that would be the thing I would put in the pot. If there's room for more later, I'll come back with some others, but I mean, probably we'll go to Nicky next in terms of where your concerns are, Nicky.
Yeah, and so just in terms of where we've come from before the March 8th update to now, we're not seeing many lenders moving. So as at today, the only lenders who have softened their position are Clydesdale, Virgin Money and Skipton. So they are there or thereabouts following the RICS guidance. Everybody else is either stayed the same or only moves so slightly as to not make any impact on the number of EWS ones that would be needed. And actually, Santander have actually tightened their criteria. So previously, they weren't following the EWS1 process at all. And they were asking management companies to provide the latest fire risk assessment. But their wording is now updated, and it's asked the question now, if the EWS evaluation has taken place in line with government guidance. So even though they're not asking to see the form, you actually have to go through the EWS1 process to be able to say, yes, we've done it and we comply with the guidance. What that means in terms of net effect is not as simple as saying, well, 3 lenders in and 1 lender out, because Santander is actually 11.5% of the mortgage market, whereas Clydesdale and Virgin Money together are 3.5%, are under the same legal entity. And Skipton are 1.7. So the net effect from March the 8th to now is actually that more EWS ones are going to be needed rather than less. So this 500,000 figure kind of put about by MHCLG before is just not going to materialise. And if anything, it's going to go the other way.
That's a really important stat. So I think that's good. And we'll probably, I mean, hopefully, maybe at the end, you'll be able to summarise some of these facts and send them out to everybody.
Yeah,
maybe that would be useful.
So I'll be issuing another newsletter this evening, which will have some of those facts and figures in. And if anybody wants to email me or message me via Twitter, I'm more than happy to give the links to all of those policies as well. So feel free to reach out anytime.
Thank you. So Jason, where's your biggest concern that we haven't covered yet?
Well, yeah, I said it was a good thing, but not perfect. I think you're right to touch on the fraud aspect. The form, even though it's been revised, can still be downloaded from the internet in a PDF, so anyone can put a signature on there. There's still no reference to the body of work that sits behind sign in A1, A2, B1, whatever it might conclude. It really needs to be issued under a controlled unique reference number. And we're missing a trick here as an industry, because all of those assessments that are taking place, it would be really nice to know what materials are on what buildings and where those buildings are. In particular, if the fire service have to attend an incident, that information should be made available to them.
Yeah, and what, so in terms of the data that you would gather that goes into your report that leads to a form, so that really doesn't, as far as I'm aware, doesn't go anywhere else. It's not logged anywhere. It's not put into a database of building makeup. It's literally for you to be able to cover yourself if your form is queried later on. Is that right?
As much as the industry has tried to develop a portal, there is a cost to that. And I think because of that cost implication, it really doesn't encourage people to upload their reports or their certificates or otherwise. And, you know, in an ideal place for me would be that the government have a portal in which that certificate gets issued to the end user or the building owner, and mandatory those assessments, however good, bad or indifferent they've been done, should be uploaded onto that portal. And some kind of oversight and governance, even if it's a check and balance to see those persons that are proven or showing to be competent, that somebody actually checks that.
Get faith in it. Okay, so that's great, and I think we'll probably come around a second wave of all of this. So I think if we go to Steve, and then we'll go back around the loop again. But Steve, what's your burning topic?
I think there's a couple of things. The form
you can only have one.
Right. Okay.
Behave yourself, right, and then we'll come around again.
Right. The form is too low a level of assessment, given we've got a building safety crisis. And I'm going to sneak another one in. The threshold for IN and CEng is too high, given the number of buildings that need a full Type 4 intrusive risk assessment. Don't limit it just to the facade, and widen the expertise that can undertake these assessments.
Okay, so broadening the signatories then, right? Okay, great. I'll go to the next one, which kind of leads into that. I think is the number of qualified and competent people that can do this work. And I think I saw something pop up in the chat earlier. I'm not looking at the chat properly, but when I talked about the 10%, 90% split, that was about 10% of the forms we see are A graded, so A1, A2, A3, and then about 90% are in the B grades, B1 or B2. So if we take this to its logical conclusion that really, if we say that only an IEng or a CEng MI Fire-E can sign off or do the work for a B graded building, and we're looking at that being about 90%, 80-90% of the stock that might need an EWS1 form, there are vanishingly few properly qualified signatories with the correct insurance and willing to do EWS1 work. And we're actually doing some research into that at the moment. So some of the CEngs and IEngs in the audience will have probably had an email from us over the last week just asking them to confirm some stuff. But what we're trying to work out is how many people, if all of them were doing this work, are actually available to do this work, and how many years would it take to work through the backlog with people that are deemed to be competent and properly qualified. And the view is that those two numbers don't align. You know, I think it's going to be measured in many years to work through this backlog. So that was my next one. So we'll go back to Nicky again and see if there's another one that Nicky wants to raise.
Yeah, I'm just going to kind of add on to the things that we're talking about. So when you trigger an EWS1 or when a lender does, we kind of all think that we're working to the March 8th guidance at the moment, don't we? Yeah, everybody knows. So today when I looked at HSBC, they had a really unusual criteria, which was if on buildings of all heights, if there's flammable cladding around the main route of escape or linking multiple floors of the building, even if it's less than 25% of a single elevation. And I thought that's really specific and strange, and where has that come from? And I went looking for it, and Rick has actually updated their Q&A guidance today for lenders. So if you are not looking out for that, you wouldn't know that that exists. So that they've actually updated their guidance, I think yesterday, not today. But HSBC is the only bank that's picked up on that. So it's not clear whether HSBC have prompted Ricks on that or vice versa, but none of the other lenders have picked up on that guidance.
There was a reference to, in the original Ricks guidance, the 8th of March guidance, to cladding around protected routes. So there was something buried in there, but probably it hasn't been lifted out. Only HBS. I mean, Jason, do you want to jump in on that one, just to pick up that point? But
yeah, it comes from an earlier guidance from Ricks, but you know, regardless of percentage, I wouldn't really. It's a bit objective, isn't it? Really. So I wouldn't even look at that. Really, what the assessments should be is an absolute classification of the materials used and their fire classifications. And if you end up having an unknown and using assumptions, then it's not really concluded, in my view. There's still work to be done. The problem is, I guess, a lot of these assessments are being undertaken as risk-based, and therefore it's subjective. What one person may view to be a low risk, another person having perhaps more experience may realize the risks. And that's why we have professionals operating at the appropriate level, but actually, you know, 2 engineers out there doing this kind of work can conclude to two different assessments outcomes. So
it's really good to hear your view on that, Jason. I guess from my point of view, and probably from the residents' point of view, they're looking to kind of go with a lender that will mean that they can avoid getting into the EWS1 process. When the lender sets that as their criteria, unfortunately, they're already into the EWS1 process before they hit you, and you make the decision that actually it's not a concern. So it's kind of for the residents, I think, more important to see which lenders can I go to where I'm not going to need to go through the EWS1 process.
Yeah, I've seen people trying to, yeah, absolutely right, go to several lenders in order to find someone that can lend money. But let's not forget, there's 2 different criteria here. So, you know, the EWS itself is just there really for the lenders to understand if it's a safe asset in which to lend money against. The life safety aspect of it is a separate criteria, and all of that assessment for the external wall materials that make up that wall system should form then part of the overall fire risk assessment for the building and understanding of what that is in order to manage those risks, you know. So there's you know, quite clear two different things going on there.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
Steve, can we jump on to you? What do you?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can agree with post-Grenfell. We've got a major public safety issue. We've got thousands of blocks, thousands of buildings. The notion of what's compliant, what's acceptable, what's safe is now being completely distorted. We have got too many different things going on. EWS1 was to stabilise the lender's decision on the basis of valuation reports. It's now creeped into being a hybrid building safety assessment just for the facades. We don't know how deep it goes through the facades and into the internal compartmentation issues. Whereas post-Grenfell, we really need every building now, in order of priority, to have a full building-wide, intrusive, Type 4 risk assessment that picks up everything. And ideally, and in the 3rd session, look at what other countries have done. Australia did a state-level audit. Cladding and evacuation were their 2 key components. Scotland, in the past month, has announced free building safety assessments to all impacted buildings. And it's looking at a wider criteria, and it is specifically said moving away from EWS1. We don't know what they're going to introduce and what criteria yet. So we've got two main different stakeholders now involved, and we don't have a strong direction. And we have focused on a very high level of chartered engineers and incorporated engineers. Well, what about all the accredited risk assessors? What about all the other fire professionals? What about the building engineers? What about the charter surveyors, etc.? So I think we've moved from an instant to the disaster to crisis to a free-for-all, and we need to contract again.
Thanks, Steve. I think just on the point to pick up on, I mean, for somebody that gets into the detail of EWS1 forms like I do, and this is a sort of encyclopedic knowledge of it, one of the key changes between EWS1 version 1 and version 2 is that the RICS have made a specific point on the front page to say EWS1 is not a life safety certificate. It should not be taken as confirmation that other works relating to fire safety in other parts of the building are not required. So it makes a key point that on the front page that this is not a safety certificate, but unfortunately on the second page, if you have a B2, it does still ask you to say that I've concluded that in my view, the fire risk is sufficiently high that remedial works are required, which they've taken the word safety out from the B2, but it still effectively is a chartered engineer saying that this is not a safe building, it needs work. But apparently on the front page, it's nothing to do with safety, which is interesting. I think the other point that, a couple of points I wanted to raise. One is probably to Jason, is an observation on the PAS, the standard, that back to your point of variability, Jason, that there is no prescribed way of doing an investigation of the building that leads up to a professional being able to give it a B1 or a B2 grading. It's kind of do what you think is right in your own professional way of working, which I think from a fraud perspective or incompetence perspective leaves the door wide open for huge variation in result. But can you give us a view on a PAS or a prescribed way of working and whether that's going to happen and when it might happen?
Yes, so it's an industry response, really. There needs to be a consistent method in order to assess these buildings and assess them, I suppose, demonstrating a consistent method of doing that. And the methodology of the PAS should allow you to do that, even though it'll be risk-based. And of course, you're quite right in what you're saying. There are a huge amount of building stock, 84,000 buildings that need to be assessed. And the best way to do that is to, in the first wave, is to go through the risk-based process and assess the ones with the higher risks first, and then work through with the other ones. We have not many people within this workspace either qualified to do the work or want to do the work. And so having some form of PAS document that allows that to filter through first is a good thing, and it allows time for the industry to up the training standards in order to upskill people to demonstrate that they have the understanding. So I think it's evolving. The PAS is out for probably consultation round about June, with it likely, depending on number of comments received, likely to be live around about September. So you've still got some way to go before that's out.
Yeah, and then and presumably, so just to come back on the RICS guidance that's come out, that effectively is, for everybody's complete awareness, is designed to reduce the initial demand for EWS1. So fewer valuers requesting EWS1 from the building owner or manager, or from the resident, the mortgagee, that then would subdue some of the demand for the work, which helps us deal with having not enough people that can do the work. But from what Nicky is telling us, that we're actually seeing the opposite playing out, that the demand for EWS1 in the first place seems to be increasing, and we've now only marginally increased the pool of people that can do the work by including a few INGs, of which there are not very many, to actually go and do this work. And we've got RICS, for example, sending an email to one of the clients we've dealt with saying that their members should not sign B grade, specifically saying RICS members should not be signing B grade EWS1 forms. So they've obviously taken the view that there is no equivalence. They don't meet the equivalence criteria.
But in checking that building stock, they can sign A1, A2, and then use that as a filter. It's a positive, but industry is behind the curve really, and we need to train people. And even if you looked at how to train people, there's only the RICS course available at the moment, and you're quite right, they can't sign the B1, B2. So what we really need is that engagement with universities and institutions to put training programs in place in order to upskill people, because there are other things happening in industry that are going to come out, like the building safety bill and the fire safety bill. And when they do, external wall analysis and assessments of those materials will form part of a risk assessment. And so it's critical really that the building owner understands those materials, how they made up, and whether those materials have been installed consistently throughout the building. So there's a lot to do.
Nicky, sorry.
Sorry, yeah, it was just to add on a point. So in the lending criteria for NatWest today, I spotted that they only accept B ratings from a CEng. So they've diverted from RICS guidance in that way. They're not accepting IN.
Yeah, that might be a delayed response. Maybe it might be that they've taken a view that they don't believe that IN is sufficient, because the interpretation was getting stricter and stricter prior to the new guidance coming out. So these are all unknowns. But I think the thing that ties the lack of standardization in with qualification and competence is the thorny issue of insurance, or lack of. So sorry, everything, Jason, from and if you can come on to the bit that in a minute, but what we see is everything from fire engineers saying, I don't touch EWS1, I can't get insurance cover for it, not interested, like to do it, but not willing to, right through to, we've got 10 million of PI, come to us. So this seems to be everything in between, if all of those things are real. I'm not saying that they are, because I haven't seen it with my own eyes, but Jason, from a practitioner's perspective, what are your views on insurance and kind of what's happening now and what you've heard?
Yeah, I think it changes weekly, maybe daily, some weeks. But there's two things here, right? Just because you're chartered or just because you're IEng doesn't mean that you are suitably qualified. So you still have to demonstrate that you are suitably qualified and have experience to do that work. And in some instances, the charter allows that demonstration because it's got a higher criteria to go through than IEng. And it's not to say that IEng people are not qualified, they are, but they have to demonstrate that. So in a lot of instances where you do supply, or they do supply an EWS form, they have to supply a letter that goes along with it often to demonstrate that. To touch on the other point with insurance companies have retracted from this workspace, and they don't want to provide insurance to people carrying out this work because, quite simply, they don't understand what the risks are to them. There are no claims within that space, and until those claims are known, which is the back end of Grenfell inquiry, plus probably 6 months when prosecutions start, they'll have a feel for the claims that are likely to happen, and so they'll have something in which to work off. The government intervention will happen, and so the government are looking at different schemes so that chartered engineers can have the appropriate level of PI insurance to undertake work on buildings, but the assessment will be for, as I understand it, for buildings above 18 meters. So it still leaves a gap for those below 18 meters. And it is a challenge. Premiums have gone up, and there are not many companies offering insurance for any engineer, let alone chartered engineers. And large businesses that have large deductibles, it's probably more comfortable for those insurance companies to offer policies to them, although we are seeing through research more and more types of exclusions being placed on existing policies. And I would encourage anyone to read that very carefully, because those types of exclusions might infer that actually for any kind of fire engineering work, let alone external facade work, you're probably not covered.
Yeah. No, that's really useful. Thank you. I think what we're going to do, actually, we need to have a quick chat about what's next. We've covered some of it. So if we park the bad stuff, I think we've covered most of the key points. But in terms of what happens next, so let me go to everybody one by one and sort of say, so Nicky, tomorrow you are the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government. You are the President of RICS. You need to sort out, what would you change tomorrow if you could be granted one wish to make things better? Where would you be?
If the government fully funded and they did away with the loan scenario, all of this goes away, because it doesn't matter if it happens in 2 years' time or 5 years' time, it's going to be funded and the lenders know that. So EWS1 just goes away as an issue.
Oh, because you're not going to end up with a whole bunch of people in negative equity or handing their keys back, or right? Okay,
so that would be my wish.
So funding, right? So Steve, what would you change in addition to funding?
I think if we look at the Australian model in the state of Victoria, they led state-backed assessments of the cladding and the ability to evacuate the building. Instead of assuming it's safe, prove it's safe. Scotland has advanced that and is now adopting a similar approach of state-funded free building assessments for all impacted buildings, and the calls have went out very, very quickly. They built that up over the space of 12 months. We've now had 4 years. As Secretary of State of this government department, I'm deeply concerned about Grenfell 2, the collateral damage to residents' families, the prospect of bankruptcy, the prospect of Grenfell 2, the prospect of homelessness, and we have no emergency housing capacity. They need to step up. They need to move away from the industry-led solution to a state-led solution now, and do it quick, sharp.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Jason.
Yeah, Steve's kind of right there. There is a crisis. Government do need to step in. There needs to be this wider intervention. Insurance, we've talked about, is one thing. And I really do feel for the people that are in these homes, not knowing whether they're in a safe building or unsafe building, or even what costs they're going to be facing. And in particular, those buildings that have been placed on wait and watch, for example, is terribly unfair and it shouldn't happen. So they can find the money. It's there somewhere, right? And I know with the other crises that are happening with the pandemic, it's not a bottomless pit of money, but they are the leaders of the country and they can do something if they so wish.
Brilliant, thanks.
I think what's interesting on that, Jason, is the Welsh Government were given 80 million via the Barnett formula of funds, and they reallocated it to COVID spending rather than the cladding. But then it turned out that they had multitudes more than that still ready to spend on COVID. So there was actually no need at all to move that money away from cladding, and they could have done something with it there and then. So it's interesting to see how the funding plays out versus COVID as such, particularly in the Welsh model.
I agree with you.
So I think one last thing, and we're going to open to Q&A, just something I want to drop in. So if I was in that position, the thing I would really like to know at scale is how bad are these buildings? These buildings that are being lined up for millions of pounds worth of remediation, regardless of who funds it, whether it's residents with forced loans, whether it's insurance-backed guarantees, whether it's building safety fund, is how materially dangerous are they, and what other ways are there of managing that risk more effectively? Because I've long said that even if you threw a limitless amount of money at this problem, there are only so many scaffold tubes out there. There's only so many square meters of cladding that can be produced in a day. There's only so many trades. people will have to wait for a long time for their building to be remediated. And one of the ways that we're starting to see that happening is split work packages where decladding is taking place. So scaffold goes up or cherry pickers go up or whatever, cladding comes off, but the reclad is then delayed. So you end up in this period of nudeness on the building and probably a greater fire risk potentially than you had before you started. So, and that's being done to manage material availability and funding, and we're not actually putting safety at the heart of what we're doing. So I think if we actually looked in the round and said, what is the safest way to deal with this building and the residents that live in the building, then we may well go down a different path, but we're being guided by closing dates for funding allocations, and we're being guided by availability of engineers, and there's lots of other things that we're doing that the tail is sort of wagging the dog. So I think that's where I think we're going to draw a line. I haven't thought through how we're going to do Q&A. I know Steve's been active in the chat. Do you want to pull people in, Steve, or do we just want to go to gallery and go hands up? What do you think?
I think as an alternative, it's very hard to follow the chat and see all the hands, can't see the full screen. I want to pose one question. The white elephant in the room is limiting the assessments to just cladding. In every building across the country, it's beyond cladding. It's compartmentation, it's fire doors, it's separation. And if we look at other large fatality events in high-rise buildings, such as the MGM Grand Hotel fire, which killed over 100 people, that fire all spread internally. There was no cladding. So we need to assess the buildings, prioritise those most at risk, and get adequate funding to them and have them prioritised. What other solutions are there out there? Who is driving the current solutions? And how do we get back to safe, manageable homes?
Brilliant, thank you. I've seen a hand go up, so I'm going to try. I haven't done a Q&A like this live before with so many people, so I'm going to go to Andrew Yakub, if I can, whose hand I saw first.
Hi there. Yeah, thank you so much for hosting tonight, and thank you to everyone in the panel. I think you've all touched on some really good points. From my perspective as a leaseholder, I think the point that hasn't been touched on enough is who's liable to pay, and we started to talk about that towards the end. Just to give some quick context, we're in a 4-story building under just under 12-meter building height, 50% HPL cladding, and a very nominal amount of ACM. We've got PIR type insulation behind, so combustible material, and we've been given a rating of B2 after an intrusive survey. Now, we're in a slightly fortunate position at the minute. We may not need a waking watch or alarm. That's the view of the fire engineer that carried out the assessment, but our health and safety and fire risk assessors who just completed an assessment recently aren't on board with that. So there's a bit of convincing still to do there. Now, because we're under 18 meters, there's no real support from the government at the minute. So we're in a very difficult situation where leaseholders are very worried about the risk of bankruptcy and other issues where, you know, we're also sitting in negative equity because it's a new build development, property market is suffering, etc., because of COVID, and you know, there's a lot of things happening at the same time. So from our perspective as leaseholders, yes, it's very important to be in a safe building, but in a building that we can afford to live in. Now, I wanted to ask what the thoughts are of the panel as to a situation like this, which I think many other residents will be facing. I think there are plenty of buildings like us in the same situation. So just wanted to get a viewpoint of the panelists to, you know, where should we as leaseholders be going to from here? Because the NHBC will come back and say, well, it complied with building regulation Part B of the time of initial notice. This isn't our problem, and we're gonna fight to try and get progress with them, but okay, we don't think we'll be very successful. So sorry, a very long question.
Thank you, Andrew. What I'll do, just before we address the point, thank you for the detail, but in terms of panelists, I think what we need to do is just make sure that we answer questions generically as opposed to diving into the detail on particular buildings, because I think we'll be here all night, and it's going to be really difficult.
No,
so I think so. One generally, so I'll open up with that. The reason we are in the situation that we're in is because of regulatory failure over decades. Okay, and my personal view is we need to look to the organisation that creates the regulatory system, which is our government, and we, by voting, put our government in to represent us. Therefore, ergo, the taxpayer needs to step forward and say, this is on all of us, and then we need to recover whatever we can from people that have done wrong along the way. So whether that's an HBC guarantee, whether it's suing developers or designers through the courts or whatever afterwards to recover the money. So I think my starting point is one that we ethically, morally in this country, we do not punish the victims of crime. Okay, so that is my view, but we do also need to make sure that people are safe. So we need to have that indemnity in there that means we can actually get all of the nasties out on the table, and we can say this is what we're going to do to manage this risk or to fix it, to remediate. So that would be my view. Steve, do you want to jump in with a thought?
Yeah, I mean, I think looking at the questions and looking at the kind of response, it's do we have a good map of all the issues now? Because even in the past 2 months, from the Grenfell inquiry revelations to other concerns coming through the woodwork, we don't even know what the extent of the problem is. And in the chat, we see building people under 18 metres, under 9 metres raising issues about their buildings. How do we stop? How do we stabilise? How do we recover? Because is the current 4-year process to where we are now, has it worked? And if it not, how do we move forward?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Anyone else from the panel want to come in on that?
Yeah, I guess I just want to say that that's entirely what Matt and I are trying to solve. So Matt's database and my database are both looking to solve that data issue. We can't prioritise risk unless we have this data of kind of what is the height of your building, what are the issues, and things like knowing whether there are people who need assistance in evacuating or whether there's elderly residents. That kind of information is really going to help you prioritise the risk. So unless we get volume of data coming into those databases, it's really difficult to push something back out to the campaign groups or to the government to say, you know, this is real data, here's our data, where's yours?
Yeah. So just quickly go across, I think the next hand I've got up is Deepa, and I think this question is probably going to end up winding its way towards Jason. So Deepa, tell us, I think I know what you're going to ask, but go ahead.
Hi, everybody. My question is around housing associations and how engaged are they with fire engineers on actually scheduling in EWS surveys, particularly for those buildings that have been remediated, like for example, mine. Because I've recently completed a survey with some of my Peabody residents, and some of them have had their EWS survey, some of them have had them but don't know the results, some of them haven't got a clue whether they've had one or not, and not all these buildings have been remediated, so it seems a little bit all over the place. Can I have an expert's opinion, please, on where this is actually standing, because we are not getting any kind of truthfulness or honesty from our housing association. Thank you.
Jason.
I guess it's for the housing association to address and to respectfully respond to your question. From what I've seen, activity-wise, housing associations are taking it seriously. They do hold a large amount of building stock, and it's impossible to cover all of that in one go. In particular, because there's not enough engineers doing this work, and whether that's what we've already talked about, not having the qualifications or also not having the insurance requirements. I'm going to touch upon it as well because we haven't. Part of the reason why we're in this mess is because a lot of this type of work is highly skilled. There are a lot of things that need to be assessed. You need a broad understanding of a lot of things, such as, material science, mechanical systems, electrical systems, and indeed fire engineering, smoke production, and movement of people. So when we pay in general, I'm talking about the industry in general, want to go to the bottom line and pay for a cheap job for fire risk assessments or for any fire understanding or analysis of a building, that has to be wrong. It has to be proportionate to the amount of work that needs to be undertaken. And qualifications of people working within this workspace. So again, in law, there is no requirement for a fire engineer to demonstrate understanding or prove competency, but that also has to change, surely. And so, you know, I've gone off on a tangent a little bit from the original question, but it's kind of all linked, really.
Just on that one, Dupe, I'll jump in, then we're going to go to Amit next. Having just come off the phone before this with another fire engineer that does a lot of housing association work, he was talking me through the tender, some of these large tenders that are coming out at the moment, and it's almost it's a procurement-driven bulk race to the bottom kind of, well, because you do more of these, they're going to get cheaper, and the reality is they don't get any cheaper because they're a multiple of time. We're not making widgets. So whether that might be coming to play in your situation, I don't know. I don't know the client organization well enough, whether they are targeting in a different way. What I do find strange and concerning with yours is that you've actually been through a remediation project and you're waiting for your green light at the end of the process. You're not waiting to see whether you need to go through that process. So that's a strange wrinkle with yours. But just on that point, the housing associations, when you actually speak to them, when they're dealing with tens of thousands of properties, this doesn't excuse any of it, but this is a huge task. And the goalposts are moving around all the time. So it is difficult, but I think my view with that would always be that you need to communicate and you need to be open and transparent with people. And, you know, if you're 2 years away from it, tell you you're in the queue and it's 2 years' time, at least you know what to work with rather than not speaking. So Amit, let's jump to you if you want to come off mute.
Hi there, thank you very much. My question is directed to Jason, and it is about combustibility or limited combustibility as defined in the EWS1 form. It refers to BS 9991 2015 as materials of limited combustibility. We have a lot of buildings where cavity walls have PIR insulation or sandwich panels, which are not ACM, but they have steel liners and they have PIR insulation in between. How does that material get classed as A1 or A2 when it doesn't sit neatly with the definition given in BS 9991, because it has a lot of combustible PIR core insulation in it? I'm asking this generic question because I think a lot of buildings, modern buildings, have the same situation where you have these Kingspan panels or things like that, which have a lot of PIR insulation core in them. Thank you.
So the first iteration of the EWS form was developed with stakeholders, but I don't think that it was a formal interaction with the Institution of Fire Engineers that provided guidance about combustibility and limited combustibility. And even in the second iteration, whilst they strongly, because I know I was on it, provided information to RICS about what should be on that form, again, some of that was ignored, and maybe some of that for good reason I can't begin to tell you because I don't know. What the assessments should be, and this is my view, every material that goes into that building, because it's sold, would be tested and would have a combustible rating. So broadly, each one of those components that make up that wall system would have something like a BBA or an ETA certificate, so British Board of Agreement, or a European technical assessment. And in there, it will say whether it's, you know, a European classification, ABC, whatever it might be. Could be a DIN classification, so German classification, or otherwise. But the tables don't align perfectly because the tests are slightly different, the furnaces are slightly different, the temperatures raised are slightly different. But there is a broad line between those classifications. And if a manufacturer is claiming limited combustibility or non-combustible product, there'll be something to back that up as test evidence. Mm-hmm. You know, whilst they've referenced 9991, it's not. I suppose it's not bad, because what they're aiming to do is present this information to the layperson as much as they can without getting into the technical detail too much. But I would certainly look for a certificate for each of those constituent components.
Okay, thank you.
Brilliant. Right, okay, I've got some questions from email from Patrick. So the one for Nicky, actually. How many lenders are now lending in line with the RICS guidance?
So more or less, I have to say more or less because there are slight quirks, 3.
Of how many, roughly?
So I've looked at 23 so far, and there are 3. So there's probably 50 that I could go out and check, but once you get below kind of 20, you're talking about the 0.5% of the market. So there's not much point in going any further than that, really, because it's so small it won't make any impact. But yeah, so 3 have kind of brought themselves in line more or less with Rick's guidance.
Excellent.
That's not to say that more won't, because obviously they could still change position.
Hi, Matt. Just to point out, Julian's had his hand up for quite some time.
Julian, did you say?
Julian.
Oh, hi there. Thank you. I've got a few questions, but I'm going to stick to one. Our issue is that we do not trust our EWS1 report. We've seen it, and that is rare. Through most of the people I've spoken to, their housing associations, their building owners, their management agents won't even share the EWS1 report. And the people I've spoken to, it's like ours. We have a B2 rating, and that hinges on the combustibility rating of the building materials. The report, from what I can see, makes no attempt to actually establish what those ratings are. It guesses. In fact, with regards to the decking, it says, we do not know if this timber is treated or untreated, so we are going to assume it's untreated. Regarding the cladding, it shows a link to a third-party website, not the company that supplied our cladding, and it says this cladding is available in 2 ratings. One has a fire safe rating, one doesn't, and it makes no attempt to work out which one was chosen. There's no.
Okay, so Julian, sorry, can I just jump in? I want to respond to this, but can I just say, please do not name in public forum the company that just.
I'm not. No. I'm not going to.
So, Jason,
I like to. Yeah, thanks, Matt. I've got to go.
Come back in on this.
Look, as far as these assessments go, for me, they absolutely should be shared, and they should be shared with the responsible person and other stakeholders. They form part of what the duties imposed upon the responsible person under the regular reform fire safety order is that they have to undertake a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment of the building. So the question is, how can they undertake a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment if that report is not shared? They have to share that report. And for every component and every wall system and every cladding system and insulation, the manufacturer needs to be identified, the material fire classification needs to be identified. And where you have something that's not identified, and perhaps in those reports, and being objective, they've listed out assumptions on worst case scenario.
That's what they've done.
But it leaves, for me, it leaves the report in a position that still needs to be concluded. Okay, so there's, for everything that's gone into your building, somebody's designed it, somebody's supplied it, somebody's installed it, somebody's built your building. All of that information's been sent to building control for them to sign off. So the information's out there and it exists. It's just there's a little bit of detective work to be done. And perhaps on the older style buildings, it may be proven to be a bit more difficult to get that information. But
there's no attempt made on that. There's been no attempt.
So the building should be assessed and shown to be compliant or non-compliant at the time of conception. That's your starting point. Always has to be. Even before you start poking holes into a building, because you need to do it intelligently. And there's no point opening up parts of the building if you don't really know what you're looking for or where to look for it. So those wall systems need to be identified and whether they are installed to the manufacturer's recommendations, because they would have built a wall system and had it tested. And what you're trying to do is demonstrate that it's been built to that tested wall system. So in some circumstances, it could have an 8414 test. And even where there are departures, and Steve mentioned this earlier, where Scotland have not had a reliance on this time. But you can consult with another document, 9414, to see if those departures are permissible or not. So there should be, you know, a lot of detail in these reports.
I think, Julian, what I would say to you is, one, if you haven't spoken to your management company about this already and raised your concerns, then do that. It sounds like you probably have.
We have, and they're ignoring us.
Sorry, say again?
We have, and so far they haven't responded.
Right, okay. So then the next step to do is, if you haven't shared it with us yet, please do. We'll take a look at it, and if we think this needs expert review, there may be other dots we can join for you that makes your case stronger when you go back, because we might have seen lots of other similar reports from a similar vendor that we might have concerns about. And then I think the ultimate route is one of potentially looking at a legal avenue with your management company that sort of says, look, you know, especially if you're being charged for that report as well, if that's finding its way onto your service charge, then I think your initial claim is against your management company. But I think there's a long way to go before you get to that point. You can become a lot more formal with them. And what we're seeing in a number of cases now is that where there are these disputed reports, that they're being recommissioned with a new engineer. And that might be because they're very comprehensive but come to the wrong conclusion, but more likely than not, they're just a very lightweight report that if you're seeing problems with it, if that was to go to a bank, if, for example, that had been a B1 and that went to a bank and they read it, the likelihood is that they would throw it back at you with further questions. And we've seen evidence of that this week. It doesn't tend to happen with B2s because they don't end up with the banks to get reviewed at that point because nobody can borrow. So an erroneous B1 will often get picked up by a bank. An erroneous B2 won't, because it doesn't go to somebody formally for review. So that would just be the point on that. But feel free to contact us. This question here, sorry. Anyone else got a hand up, Steve? Have you spotted anyone else?
I can't see anyone else, but one question's popped in. How many EWS1s have been uploaded to the formal portal?
Okay, I can answer that one. As at yesterday, there were 6 live, and I think it was either 3 or 4 that were in progress, but you couldn't view. And that's in 5 months. So just give everyone an idea of scale. I don't know what's in the pipeline, but the high probability is if anybody was to go and look for their building on that site at the moment, you would not find your EWS1 form. We collect a lot of them. We're at about 115 now, 115. They are really difficult to get without fire engineers actively providing them to you. The way that we get them is that some of them are published to the web, most aren't. Most people they're sent via residents who say, here's a copy of my form, and then we will catalogue it, and it forms part of our database that went out into the LBC story on gradings. There's something in one of the broadsheets coming out soon. So there are people looking at this, but it's very difficult to, let's put it this way, we're a long way from the 5,000 that apparently have been done as at last October, according to the RICS. So the more the merrier, but we can all draw our own conclusions about real numbers.
Another quick question is, someone's asked that should the fire bill go through and then require external water surveys as part of building risk assessment, isn't EWS1 then redundant? And if we can't get EWS1 done right just now, then we've got no prospect of expanding the fire bill.
Jason?
Sorry, I really have to go. I've got another call.
Okay,
yeah, make.
Thanks,
Just very quickly, I think the EWS will phase out probably over time, but I think it's here to stay for the next 5 years at least. There's so much building stock that needs to be assessed. But anyway,
yeah, thanks, Jason. I'll just quickly jump in on that one, Steve, if that's okay. We've long been saying ever since this was first mooted that the new fire risk assessment would include the external wall. Is how on earth can we do this? I mean, I've heard various numbers, but one of the numbers which seems quite credible is about 1.7 million buildings that would fall under the fire safety order, residential multi-occupancy buildings of any height that would need a fire risk assessment. So if that was the real number, we're looking at 1.7 million external wall assessments as a part of that. That's an order of magnitude greater than we've got with EWS1 at the moment. So, and there really hasn't been any discussion that I've seen from the industry or from government as to how on earth would we resource this? How many years would it take to be able to produce a credible external wall assessment for a fire risk assessment? So that is a big unknown. We don't really know the staging dates yet, but it's almost an unachievable task, I think, would be my view. Any other questions, Steve? We're going to wrap up.
I think another one is the capture of the requirements for EWS1 under 18 metres and under 11 metres, and whether the government's numbers stack up. I'm not just getting these in the chat, I'm getting them in email and DMs and all sorts just now. So where is EWS1 applicable, and does the government's numbers stack up on the exemption criteria?
Nicky?
Apologies, I wasn't listening because I was trying to answer some of the questions in chat.
Okay,
Steve.
I'll jump in, Steve. We could do this one. So official numbers, if we call them that, are from MHCLG is broadly 12,000 buildings over 18 metres, 76,000 between 11 and 18, and then sub 11, who knows? I published something the other day where we've got a freedom of information request, and they work on a range of anywhere from just over 1 million blocks to just over 2 million blocks. So I would take that we don't know how many of those buildings there are, but we do get contacted by a lot of people in blocks that are in that sub 11 metre height category in relation to EWS1. And the big question is, from a lot of people, is how is the 11 metres calculated? I always work on the height to the slab of the top inhabited floor as being my height. A lot of people are thinking, well, we can make our building a bit taller because then we might get into the forced loan scheme. Other people want to stay underneath the forced loan scheme, even when the forced loan scheme happens. So I tend to work more on stories, but yeah, from what I'm seeing, most of the volume is in the low-rise buildings. So, Steve.
Coming, 1 second. Hiya, sorry. Hiya. Hiya.
I think somebody's got their mic open. I think just to respond to that one, we lose the majority of people in low-rise buildings, in individual dwellings. And that's why campaigns such as fire detection has been incredibly successful in reducing the fire statistics. But we have the likes of Grenfell, we've had near misses at Barking, Worcester Park, Bolton, Crewe. We've had major fires in hotels, care homes, residential, and other facilities. We need to go back to first principles and almost start again. And look at what other countries have done and grab a hold best practice, grab a hold of what's worked, and stop flogging the dead donkey, which isn't working. Because as soon as the fire safety bill comes in, or the building safety bill comes in, we have got another round of sophistication and assessments and costs heading towards residents. Let's assess the buildings fully, properly just now, prioritise those at most at risk, fund those at most at risk, and then look at how we deal with the risks beyond the very highest levels. Okay.
Thank you, Steve. I'm going to wrap up now because we've run over by 10 minutes. I'm actually saying that a hand's just gone up. I don't know who that is. Anyone see a hand up or no? We are available afterwards for questions or via email or Twitter DM or whatever. So I'm just going to wrap up now. I'm going to thank all of the panel panelists. So Nicky, Steve, Jason, if you can still hear us in the background, I know he's gone on to a call. Thank you everybody for attending. I hope you found it useful. Thank you for your questions. And just remember, you know, if you need us, send us a message. If we can't answer the question, we probably know somebody who can, and we'll distribute questions out to various people. And just sort of remain for me to say, hopefully see you at the next one. We'll post this to YouTube tomorrow. If you've got any ideas of what you want to talk about at the next meetup, then send us some ideas for topics, but I don't think we're going to run out of anything to talk about anytime soon. But just want to wish you all a safe evening, and thank you for coming, and we'll see you again at the next one.